Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Premeditated, A Trust Betrayed, Life Sabotaged, A Love Undaunted by Susanna Haymond. And this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. The breeze flowing in from outside flirted with the drawn curtains at the open window, displaying a world of darkness beyond the director's home office. A large mahogany desk sat between two windows facing the door. All was quiet in the cozy room, but it was only the calm before the storm. Purity Drug Rehab Center's director, Brian Ward, lay in front of his desk on the plush carpeted floor, hand limp, chest still. A soft knock was heard at the door, then a woman's voice called, "Brian, dinner's ready." Silence was the only reply. "Brian?" A click signaled the turning of the doorknob, followed by the entrance of Beatrice Ward, Brian's lovely wife. "Brian, dinner is on the table and—" She halted mid-sentence, seeing her husband lying prone on the floor. "Brian?" she cried out, the guttural sound pushing through her throat. Blood drained from her face, leaving it pasty white. Kicking herself into emergency mode, Beatrice ran to her husband's side. "Come on, Brian, wake up! Don't leave me!" She shook his arm, jostling his body. No response. She placed two fingers over his wrist, searching for a pulse. She felt a steady, albeit light, pressure thump against the weight of her fingers. Hands shaking, Beatrice reached for the phone on the desk and called for help. She was told an ambulance would be there shortly. While she waited, Beatrice went to the desk to retrieve his insulin. She pulled the sleeve of her husband's shirt up and injected the medicine. Leaving the syringe on the floor by Brian's still form, she ran shaky hands over her husband's face. His lips, she noted, were turning blue. "Come on, Brian, please!" Tears trailed down her cheeks as they clogged her voice. "Don't leave me, Brian. You can't leave me." Sirens were heard wailing in the distance. Her heart stuttered in terror. Beatrice left her husband to meet the paramedics at the door. She didn't give them time to introduce themselves, but grabbed the arm of the man nearest her, pulling him to Brian's office. He winced as her nails dug into his arm. "He's back here. I think he's going into a diabetic coma. He's not responding to me." She swallowed a sob. "I gave him an insulin injection when I found him. I don't know why he didn't give himself one before he passed out." "Ma'am, how long has he been like this?" Cash, the man she had grabbed, dropped his gear on the floor beside Ward's still form. She stood back, wringing her hands with worry. I don't know. He's been in his office for hours. I'd finished making dinner and was calling him to eat when I found him like this." Cash checked the man's pulse and began giving him CPR, while his partner, Colton, was getting out the defibrillator pads and placed them on Brian's chest and left side. "Clear," Colton said, checking to see if his partner wasn't touching their patient. He double-checked to make certain neither he nor Cash was in contact with the unconscious man. Colton pushed the button on the defibrillator, delivering a shock and stopping the heart. The hope was that the body's pacemaker would then help Brian's heart to regain the correct rhythm. Sitting back on his heels, Colton gave his partner a grim look. "He's stable for now, but we need to transport ASAP." He turned to the distraught woman. "We need to get your husband to the hospital." She nodded her agreement and immediately replied, I want to go along." Colton nodded. "Of course." The blaring siren of the ambulance parted traffic as the emergency vehicle made its way through the city. Colton was busy in the back, setting up an IV of fluids, trying to dilute Brian Ward's glucose levels to bring them down. He glanced over at Mrs. Ward, who was running a tissue under her eyes and wiping her nose. "We're doing everything we can, ma'am," he said, trying to comfort her. She simply nodded her head, worrying the tissue in her hands. Beatrice began rocking back and forth, murmuring under her breath. I can't lose him. I can't lose him. Dear God, I can't lose him." A tear streamed down her cheek unchecked. The ambulance pulled to a stop, and the back doors flew open. Orderlies tugged the gurney out and gently set it on the ground, rolling it towards the emergency entrance of the hospital. Colton jumped out and offered his hand to Beatrice, who was scurrying down the tight aisle of the ambulance. She barely gave him notice as she took his hand, quickly releasing it once her feet hit the ground. She ran into the emergency waiting room, following her husband and other emergency personnel. When they came to two double doors, Beatrice was intercepted by a nurse who grabbed her by the shoulders, making eye contact. "Ma'am, you're going to have to wait out here. Let us do our job." Beatrice's frantic eyes were large with worry as she said in desperation, "I want to be with my husband." The nurse's voice was gentle and filled with compassion. "I'm sorry, but you can't go back there. I'll let you know how he's doing as soon as I can." More tears threatened to fall as she grasped the nurse by the hand. "Please keep me updated. I have to know how he is." "I will." Having extracted the promise, Beatrice let the woman go and sank into a nearby chair to wait. Colton walked up to the director's wife. "Is there anything I can get for you, ma'am?" She lifted her head to see the two paramedics who had come for her husband. Her voice was hoarse from crying. "No, thank you." "Is there anyone you can call to come sit with you?" Colton's partner asked. Her voice broke. "My daughter." It was then that Beatrice realized she hadn't brought her purse. I don't have my phone." Colton handed her his phone. "Use mine." Beatrice made the call and asked her daughter to go to by their home to pick up a few things. She handed the phone back. "Thank you." Her head was swimming from everything that had happened in the last half hour. Colton lightly squeezed her shoulder and said, "I'll be praying for you and your husband." She wiped her eyes with a tissue and said, "Thank you." Time was irrelevant, though it felt like Beatrice had been waiting forever to hear news of her husband. Not knowing what was happening to him just drove her crazy. She paced, unable to sit still. Growing tired, she sat but continually fidgeted with her hands. She jumped when the doors whooshed open. The doctor, along with the nurse who had stopped her, came through, entering the waiting area. Once she knew they were coming to speak with her, Beatrice stood, hands clasped in front of herself. The doctor stopped a couple of feet from her and held out his hand, his eyes somber. "Mrs. Ward, I'm Dr. Whitman." "How is he?" she asked desperately. Dr. Whitman glanced at the nurse, then turned to look back at the man's anxious wife. I'm sorry. We did everything we could to save him, but he was in a coma for too long when he came to us." Beatrice crumpled to the floor, a sob tearing from her throat. "Dear God, no! I can't live without my Brian, please, no!" The last word was drawn out as her body shuddered in grief. Wrapping an arm around the widow's shoulders, the nurse attempted to comfort the woman. "I'm so sorry." The hospital hall was filled with the anguished cries of the grieving widow. A full moon was sneaking up behind the mountain range. A light, magical feeling floated through the evening air. Anne inhaled the fresh salt air as she and Greg walked along the edge of the ocean. The sound of the waves crashing against the sandy beach filled her ears. "How long have we been together now?" Greg asked casually. Anne thought for a moment. About 6 months now." She felt a hand grip her elbow, and she turned to see Greg had stopped. He gently tugged her around so they were facing each other. His voice was gentle as he took her hands in his. "Anne, I owe you so much for showing me how to let go of my hate, anger, and unwillingness to forgive." Shaking her head, Anne replied, It wasn't me. God is the one who did the work in your heart. I was just the instrument he chose to use." "You were willing to point out my flawed thinking and taught me what forgiveness looked like by your example." Greg rubbed his thumbs over the back of her hands. "My reaction to my sister's death was to hate and seek revenge against those who took Cassie's life, but you chose to forgive them. Your spiritual life has been healthy because of your choice, where mine was filled with bitterness and was dead." Anne smiled and placed her hand on his face. She felt the smoothness of his cheek on the tips of her fingers and the roughness of his stubble in the palm of her hand. "Praise the Lord you allowed him to work within your heart." Anne felt a feeling of thankfulness bubble up within her chest. Now you work to do his will. Greg covered the hand she held to his face with his own. "During these last months, the Lord has revealed to me how much I need you by my side." Greg shifted his feet. "You've helped me get right with God. You make me laugh and give me joy. You are a woman of God who wants to do what God would have her to do. I see his light in your eyes. You are a beautiful, caring woman whom I am blessed to have in my life." The color in Anne's cheeks heightened as Greg recounted what he saw in her, and she chuckled in embarrassment. As they held each other's gaze, both could see the deep love they shared. Greg cleared his throat and dropped to one knee, taking her hands in his. Anne sniffed and wiped a couple of stray tears from her eyes, then slipped her fingers back into Greg's hand, giving him her full attention once again. "Anne Cheryl, you are my world, and I can't imagine life without you. You are the most important person to me. Will you marry me?" Her smile widened with surprise, and laughter bubbled out. Words failed her as she looked down at the diamond ring, winking up at her. It was snuggled in the little black velvet box Greg held. "Well?" he chuckled nervously. As the shock wore off, Anne squealed. "Yes!" Standing, Greg whooped. With his fingers shaking, he pulled the ring out of the cushion and placed it gently on her finger. He pulled her close as they embraced. He didn't think he could love her any more than he did right then. They stood silently loving each other and cherishing the special sweetness of the moment. Greg pulled back to meet her eye. "I love you," he said softly. "I love you," she replied. A smile bloomed across her face. Anne was filled with glee as she thought of Greg's proposal the night before. The diamond ring glittered on her hand, winking up at her. It felt odd wearing a ring on that finger. She knew it would take some time to get used to the new feeling. She parallel parked, then watched for a pause in traffic for an opportunity to hop out of her car. After the cargo van, it would be clear, but only for a moment. As soon as the van passed, she quickly opened the door and dashed to the sidewalk. Peering up at the outside of the FBI building, Anne's neck strained. She couldn't help but smile. Anne hoped to catch Shelby on her lunch break. The news she had to tell her was too good to keep. The door slid open as she approached the entrance. Anne spotted Garrett heading in her direction. When he looked up, the agent recognized her and greeted her with a smile. "Hi, what brings you here? I hope another drug lord hasn't purchased one of the security systems you designed." "Not at this time," Anne chuckled. "Actually, I'm here to see Shelby." "She's up in the office," he told her. "Thank you." "You're welcome," he continued on his way, giving a little wave. "Have a good afternoon." "You too." As Anne knocked on the open door, she spotted Shelby, red-faced, talking to someone on the phone. Her friend slammed the cell phone down on the desk, mumbling something unintelligible. She had never seen Shelby act so aggravated. Her work must be taking a toll on her, Anne surmised. Shelby glanced up, spotting Anne. Her face brightened warmly like the sun had come out on a cold, foggy morning, pushing the gloom away. "Anne, how are you?" "I'm great," Anne replied with a smile, but let it slip as she said, "But by the way your phone call ended, I take it your day isn't going too well?" "Not really," Shelby shrugged. She straightened in her chair. "Never mind that. What brings you here?" "Greg," she answered. Shelby's expression was puzzled. "Then you came to the wrong building." "No," Anne laughed. "He proposed," she said with delight, holding her hand up to show Shelby her ring. Shelby's pleasure bloomed across her face at her friend's thrilling news. "Anne, that's great!" She came around the desk to give her a hug. "I'm so happy for you." "Thank you," Anne laughed gleefully. "Have you set a date?" "We talked about it briefly," Anne nodded excitedly, "but nothing concrete." She took a breath. "Will you be my maid of honor?" "I would love to!" Shelby was exuberant. "I was thinking of having lunch together in a few days to begin planning the wedding," Anne suggested. "Sure." Anne stayed long enough to schedule their lunch date, then left to finish the rest of her errands.